Hello and welcome to Ancient Greek Archive. Tonight, let us travel together to one of the most mysterious places the ancient world ever knew. A place where the boundary between the mortal and the divine grew impossibly thin. A place carved into the side of a mountain, wreathed in mist and the heavy perfume of burning laurel, where a single woman, seated upon a bronze tripod in the darkness beneath the earth, spoke words that could topple kingdoms, redirect armies, and alter the course of civilizations for centuries to come. This is the story of the oracle at Delphi, Pythia. For more than 1,000 years, from the depths of the Greek Bronze Age to the twilight of the Roman Empire, no sanctuary in the ancient world wielded more influence than this one.
Kings and tyrants, philosophers and generals, common farmers and desperate mothers, all made the long, exhausting pilgrimage up the slopes of Mount Parnassus to hear the voice of the god Apollo, channeled through the trembling lips of a woman they called the Pythia. Think about that for a moment. Let it settle. The most powerful men in the known world, men who commanded vast armies, who held the power of life and death over millions, would travel for weeks across dangerous seas and hostile territory, bringing wagon loads of gold and silver to kneel before a woman in a darkened chamber beneath a temple floor and beg for guidance. No major war was declared, no colony founded, no constitution written without first consulting the oracle. The Athenians asked her whether they should fight the Persians. The Spartans asked her whether they would win. King Croesus of Lydia, the wealthiest man alive, asked her whether he should invade the Persian Empire. She answered them all, and her answers, cryptic, riddling, drenched in ambiguity, shaped the world. But what was really happening in that darkened chamber? Was the Pythia truly possessed by a god? Was she inhaling volcanic gases that sent her into genuine ecstasy? Or was the entire operation the most respected religious institution in the ancient world, an elaborate political machine run by shrewd priests who understood that ambiguity is the most powerful weapon in any language? Close your eyes. Breathe slowly, and let us walk together through the mist, up the winding mountain path, toward the place the Greeks believed was the very center of the earth. To understand the oracle at Delphi, you must first understand the land itself. Because Delphi was not chosen by accident, the Greeks believed, with absolute conviction, that the gods had selected this precise spot on the surface of the earth for a reason. And when you see the landscape, even in ruins, even after 2,500 years of earthquakes, landslides, and the slow erosion of time, you begin to understand why. Delphi sits high on the southwestern slope of Mount Parnassus, nearly 2,000 feet above the Gulf of Corinth, in a region the ancient Greeks called Phocis. The mountain itself rises to over 8,000 feet, its upper peaks dusted with snow well into spring, its flanks covered in dark forests of pine and cypress that whisper and creak in the wind. Below the sanctuary, the land falls away in a series of dramatic cliffs and terraces, plunging down through groves of ancient olive trees, silvery, green, twisted, some of them older than memory, until it reaches the narrow coastal plain and the shimmering blue water of the Gulf far below.
It is a landscape of verticals, of dizzying heights and shadowed gorges. The Phaedriades, the shining ones, are twin limestone cliffs that tower directly above the sanctuary, their faces gleaming pale gold in the morning sun and turning deep rose at sunset. Between them, a narrow ravine channels a stream down from the heights, and it was from this ravine that the sacred Castalian spring emerged, its cold, clear water tumbling over moss-covered rocks into a stone basin where pilgrims would purify themselves before approaching the gods. Imagine standing there in the 5th century, before the Common Era. You have traveled for days, perhaps weeks.
You've crossed the sea from one of the Greek colonies in Sicily or southern Italy, or you've walked overland from Athens or Thebes or Corinth, following rough mountain paths through bandit country. You are tired. Your feet ache. The air grows thinner and colder as you climb, and then the path rounds a bend in the mountainside, and suddenly, there it is, the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi, spread out before you on a series of terraces cut into the living rock of Parnassus.
The first thing you would notice is the light. At this altitude, the Greek sunlight has a quality that is almost supernatural, sharp, crystalline, bleaching the stone white and casting shadows so deep they look like doorways into another world. Eagles wheel in slow circles above the cliffs. The Greeks called them the birds of Zeus, and their cries echo off the rock faces, mixing with the distant sound of the spring and the murmur of wind through the pines. And then there is the silence. Not the absence of sound, but a particular quality of mountain stillness that makes every noise, a footstep on gravel, a whispered prayer, the clink of a bronze offering, seem amplified and significant. The ancient Greeks had a word for this feeling, thambos.
A kind of sacred awe, a shiver that runs through you when you sense the presence of something far larger and older than yourself. The Greeks believed that Zeus himself had confirmed Delphi as the center of the world. According to the myth, the father of the gods released two eagles from the opposite ends of the earth, one from the far east and one from the far west, and commanded them to fly toward each other. They met directly above Delphi, and so Zeus placed a great stone there, the omphalos, the navel of the world, to mark the spot forever. This stone, roughly conical, covered in a carved net pattern, stood in the inner sanctum of the Temple of Apollo, and it was one of the most sacred objects in all of Greece. To stand beside it was to stand at the exact midpoint of creation, the place where heaven and earth were closest, the place where a god might whisper and a mortal might hear. The landscape itself seemed to confirm this cosmic significance. The gorges and cliffs created natural amphitheaters of sound. The mist that frequently rolled in from the gulf below, thick, white, almost luminous, gave the sanctuary an otherworldly quality, as if it existed half in this world and half in some other, older place. The tectonic activity in the region produced occasional tremors that the Greeks interpreted as the breathing of the earth itself, the restless turning of the great serpent Python that Apollo had slain to claim this sacred ground. Because that was the founding myth of the oracle. Long before Apollo, this place had belonged to the earth goddess Gaia, and it was guarded by a monstrous serpent called Python. The young god Apollo, barely more than a child in the myth, traveled to Delphi and slew the serpent with his silver bow, claiming the oracle for himself. But the spirit of the serpent never truly left. It lingered in the earth, in the cracks and fissures of the rock, in the strange vapors that sometimes rose from the ground. And it was through these vapors the Greeks believed that the god spoke. This was not a place you visited casually. This was a place that demanded something of you: reverence, fear, humility.
And as you stood there, breathing the thin mountain air scented with pine resin and wild thyme, listening to the eagle's cry and the spring murmur, watching the mist curl between the columns of the temple like the fingers of some vast, invisible hand, you understood. You were standing at the threshold between the human world and the divine, and whatever happened next would change your life forever.
At the heart of this vast religious complex, the temples, the treasuries, the altars and monuments and sacred groves, there was a single human being, a woman, and everything depended on her tip. The Pythia was the high priestess of the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, and she was, without exaggeration, the most important religious figure in the ancient Greek world. Not a king, not a general, not a philosopher. A woman, and for most of the oracle's history, a woman chosen from among the ordinary people of Delphi, not from any noble or priestly family. In the earliest centuries of the oracle, the Pythia was required to be a young virgin. The ancient sources tell us that this changed after a particularly scandalous incident in which a consultant, a man who had come to seek the oracle's wisdom, was so overcome by the beauty of a young Pythia that he abducted her. After this violation, the priests of Delphi decreed that the Pythia would henceforth be a woman over the age of 50, though she would dress in the garments of a maiden as a reminder of the original tradition. She was chosen, according to Plutarch, who served as a priest at Delphi in the 1st century of the Common Era, and is one of our most detailed sources from among the local women of the region. She did not need to be educated. She did not need to be wealthy or well-born. She needed only to be of good character and to have lived a simple, blameless life. In fact, Plutarch specifically notes that the Pythia was often a woman who had been raised among the shepherds and farmers of the mountain slopes, a woman with no special training in rhetoric or philosophy or the arts of persuasion. This was important. The god, the Greeks believed, did not need an eloquent vessel. He needed a pure one, an empty one, a mind unclouded by learning or ambition, through which his voice could pass without distortion. Once selected, the Pythia's old life ended completely. She left her family, her home, her name. She moved into the sacred precinct of the temple and lived there in ritual seclusion, maintained at public expense. She was forbidden from sexual contact. Her diet was strictly controlled. She became, in effect, the living property of the god, a human instrument, tuned and maintained with obsessive care for a single purpose, to serve as the mouthpiece of Apollo. The preparation for a prophetic session was elaborate and deeply ritualistic. The oracle operated on only one day each month, the 7th day, sacred to Apollo, and only during the 9 warmest months of the year. During the 3 winter months, the god was believed to depart from Delphi and travel to the land of the Hyperboreans, a mythical people who lived beyond the north wind in a land of eternal sunshine. In his absence, the sanctuary fell silent. On the appointed day, the Pythia would rise before dawn and make her way to the Castalian spring, that cold mountain stream that cascaded down through the gorge between the shining cliffs. There, in the grey half, light before sunrise, she would bathe in the icy water, a purification ritual that must have been physically shocking, especially in the early spring when the water still carried snowmelt from the peaks above. The cold would have been piercing, almost violent, driving the breath from her lungs, constricting her blood vessels, flooding her body with the sharp alertness that extreme cold produces. After the bath, she would dress in the sacred robes, simple white garments, the costume of a maiden, and make her way to the temple. There, in the pronaos, the outer chamber, a goat would be presented for sacrifice. But before the animal was killed, the priests performed a test. They splashed cold water on the goat, and if the animal trembled, a full body shudder, not merely a flinch, this was taken as a sign that Apollo was present and willing to speak. If the goat did not tremble, the consultation was cancelled. The god was silent that day. Go home. Assuming the sign was favorable, the goat was sacrificed on the great altar outside the temple, its blood pooling on the stone, its smoke rising in a dark column toward the sky. The Pythia then entered the temple itself, passing through the grand colonnade into the shadowed interior. She would burn laurel leaves and barley meal on an interior hearth, the smoke thick, sweet, slightly narcotic, and she would chew fresh laurel leaves as well. Laurel was sacred to Apollo. It was said that the tree itself was the transformed body of the nymph Daphne, whom Apollo had pursued and who had been turned into a laurel to escape him. To chew the leaves was to take the god's beloved into your own mouth. To breathe the smoke was to breathe in his presence, and then she descended. Below the main floor of the temple, there was a small, restricted chamber, the adyton, the place not to be entered. This was the innermost sanctum, the Holy of Holies, and no one was permitted inside, except the Pythia and the attending priests. What happened down there, in that close, dark, smoke-filled space, was the most closely guarded religious secret in the ancient world. She was ready. The god was waiting. And the world held its breath. The adyton was small. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, describes it as a chamber deep within the foundations of the temple, accessible only by a narrow passage. It was dimly lit, perhaps by a single oil lamp, or the faint glow of coals on the inner hearth. The air was thick with the smoke of laurel and barley meal, sweet and cloying, filling the lungs with every breath. At the center of the chamber stood the sacred tripod, a tall, three-legged bronze seat, wide enough for a person to sit upon. Beside it, the omphalos stone. And somewhere beneath, according to nearly every ancient source that describes the process, there was a chasm in the earth, a crack in the living rock of the mountain, from which a strange vapor rose. This vapor was called the pneuma, the breath of the earth, the exhalation of the dead serpent Python, still breathing from its grave beneath the temple floor. And it was this vapor, the Greeks believed, that carried the voice of Apollo into the Pythia's mind. She mounted the tripod, she sat, and as the pneuma rose around her, curling through the close air of the chamber, she began to change. The ancient accounts of what happened next vary, and they are not always comfortable to read. Plutarch, who witnessed the process firsthand on multiple occasions, describes the Pythia as entering a state of enthusiasmos, literally having the god within, in which she became agitated. Her voice changed, her body trembled. In favorable sessions, this state was controlled. Even serene, the Pythia would speak in a voice that was not quite her own, delivering her prophecies in a measured, if cryptic, manner. The attending priests, the prophetae, the interpreters, would listen carefully and transcribe her words, sometimes rendering them into hexameter verse, the meter of epic poetry. But not every session went smoothly. Plutarch recounts one terrible occasion when the priests, under pressure from an important client, forced the Pythia to prophesy on an inauspicious day, when the preliminary signs had been unfavorable. The goat had not trembled willingly. The priests had drenched it repeatedly until it finally shuddered. The Pythia, sensing something was wrong, descended into the Oedipus reluctantly. Almost immediately, Plutarch tells us, she was seized by a violent and malignant spirit. She screamed. Her voice became harsh and terrible, unlike anything human. She threw herself about the chamber, crashing against the walls. The priests and the consultants who were within earshot fled in terror. They found her a short time later, collapsed and convulsing. She never recovered. She died within a few days. This account raises profound questions. What was actually happening to the Pythia in that chamber? For centuries, the ancient descriptions of vapors rising from a chasm were dismissed by modern scholars as myth or metaphor. Archaeological excavations of the temple site in the late 19th and early 20th centuries found no obvious chasm beneath the temple foundations, and the French archaeologists who led the dig declared flatly that there was no geological evidence for any kind of volcanic emanation. The vapors, they said, were a literary invention. The Pythia's trance was either faked or induced by the laurel smoke and the psychological pressure of the ritual. But in the year 2000, a team of researchers, including a geologist, an archaeologist, a chemist, and a toxicologist, published a groundbreaking study that changed everything. They discovered that the Temple of Apollo at Delphi sits directly atop the intersection of two major geological fault lines, and that these faults pass through layers of bituminous limestone, rock rich in petrochemicals. When tectonic activity caused movement along these faults, the friction and heat could liberate gases from the limestone, including ethylene, a sweet-smelling hydrocarbon gas.
Ethylene, it turns out, was once widely used as an anesthetic. In low concentrations, it produces feelings of euphoria, disembodiment, and what subjects describe as visions or hallucinations. In moderate concentrations, it can cause violent physical reactions, thrashing, screaming, loss of muscular control. In high concentrations, it can kill piss, The symptoms described by Plutarch, the trance state, the altered voice, the occasional violent episodes, the rare death, match with remarkable precision the known effects of ethylene exposure. The sweet smell of the pneuma, the small enclosed space of the adyton where the gas would concentrate, the crack in the rock through which it would seep. All of it suddenly made geological and chemical sense.
The ancient Greeks were not lying about the vapors. They were not inventing the chasm. They were describing, with impressive accuracy, a real geological phenomenon that they interpreted, as they interpreted everything, through the lens of the divine. Whether the Pythia herself believed she was possessed by Apollo, we cannot know. Perhaps she did. Perhaps the combination of fasting, ritual purification, laurel smoke, and ethylene inhalation produced a genuine altered state of consciousness that felt, from the inside, exactly like the presence of a god. Perhaps the line between chemistry and divinity is thinner than we think. What we do know is that the consultants who came to hear her believed. They believed utterly. And they acted on her words with consequences that echoed across centuries. The process for consulting the oracle was rigorous and hierarchical. Ordinary citizens might wait for days or even weeks for their turn, drawing lots to determine the order of consultation. But certain cities and individuals held the privilege of promeneia, the right to consult the oracle ahead of all others. This privilege was jealously guarded and frequently fought over. Wars were declared over promeneia. When your turn finally came, you would present your question to the priests in the pronaos. You might ask it aloud, or you might write it on a lead tablet and hand it over sealed. The priests would then convey the question to the Pythia in the adyton. Whether they delivered it exactly as asked, or whether they rephrased it, or whether they added their own commentary, we do not know for certain. This is one of the great mysteries. The priests were the intermediaries, the gatekeepers. And gatekeepers, as we know, are never neutral. The Pythia would then speak her response. The priests would interpret it, shape it, sometimes versify it, and deliver it to the waiting consultant. And in those words, ambiguous, riddling, resonant with multiple possible meanings, the fates of empires were sealed. The political power of the oracle at Delphi is almost impossible to overstate. In an age before intelligence agencies, diplomatic cables, or satellite surveillance, the oracle functioned as something like all three combined: a clearinghouse of information, a legitimizer of policy, and a shaper of grand strategy. And nowhere was this power more dramatically demonstrated than in the great crisis that defined the classical Greek world, the Persian Wars. In the year 480 before the Common Era, the Persian Empire, the largest the world had ever seen, stretching from the borders of India to the shores of the Aegean, was preparing to invade Greece. King Xerxes, the great king, the king of kings, had assembled an army that Herodotus claims numbered in the millions. Modern estimates are more conservative, but even the most cautious scholars agree that Xerxes commanded somewhere between 100 and 200,000 soldiers, supported by a massive fleet of warships. Against this colossal force, the Greek city-states could muster perhaps a tenth as many fighters. Issue in their desperation, the Greeks did what they always did in moments of existential crisis. They sent embassies to Delphi. The Athenian embassy arrived first, and the oracle's response was devastating. The Pythia, speaking through the priests, delivered a prophecy of total annihilation. "Flee," she told them. "Flee to the ends of the earth. Your city will burn. Your temples will fall. Blood will flow like rivers. There is no hope. All is lost." The Athenian envoys were shattered. But one of them, a man of extraordinary presence of mind, refused to accept this as the final word. He persuaded the delegation to approach the oracle a second time, this time as suppliants, carrying olive branches wreathed in wool, and to beg the god for a more favorable response. This was irregular, perhaps unprecedented, but the priests allowed it, and the second prophecy was different. It was still grim, still drenched in images of destruction and fire. But buried within its cryptic verses was a single phrase that would change the course of history. Divine Salamis, you will destroy the children of women. And another, safe shall the wooden wall continue for thee and thy children. The Athenians argued furiously over what this meant. Some believed the wooden wall referred to a thorn hedge that had once surrounded the Acropolis, and that the oracle was advising them to barricade themselves on the sacred hill. Others, including, most famously, the brilliant Athenian statesman and naval commander Themistocles, argued that the wooden wall meant the hulls of ships. The oracle, Themistocles insisted, was telling Athens to abandon the city, evacuate its people, and fight the Persians at sea. Themistocles won the argument. Athens was evacuated. The population was ferried to the nearby island of Salamis. And when the Persian army arrived and burned the empty city to the ground, the temples on the Acropolis reduced to blackened rubble. The Athenian fleet was waiting in the narrow straits between Salamis and the mainland. The Battle of Salamis, fought in September of 480, before the Common Era, was one of the most decisive naval engagements in human history. The outnumbered Greek triremes, fighting in confined waters where the Persians could not bring their superior numbers to bear, shattered Essex's fleet. The great king watched from a golden throne set up on the shore as his warships were rammed, boarded, and sunk, one after another, in water that turned red with blood and choked with wreckage and the bodies of drowning men. By nightfall, the invasion was effectively over. Xerxes withdrew to Assasia. Greece was saved. And it was saved, the Greeks believed, because of the oracle. The Spartans, too, consulted Delphi before the Persian invasion, and the prophecy they received was equally momentous and far more terrible. The oracle told them that either Sparta itself would be destroyed, or a king of Sparta would die. King Leonidas, upon hearing this prophecy, understood what was required. He selected 300 of his finest warriors, men who all had living sons, so that their family lines would continue, and marched north to the narrow coastal pass at Thermopylae, the hot gates where a small force might hold an army for a time. They held for 3 days. 3 days of slaughter in the narrow pass, the dead piling so high that the Persians had to climb over the bodies of their own fallen to reach the Spartan lines. When they were finally betrayed by a local shepherd who showed the Persians a mountain path around the pass, Leonidas dismissed most of his allies and remained with his 300 Spartans and a small force of the Thespians to fight a last stand. They died to the last man. Leonidas went to Thermopylae knowing he would die, because the oracle had told him that his death was the price of Sparta's survival, and he paid that price willingly. The power of the Pythia's words was not merely political, it was existential. It could make a king choose death over life, and do so not with despair, but with a fierce, quiet pride. This was the oracle at its most consequential. A woman in a dark chamber beneath a temple, breathing vapors from a crack in the earth, speaking words that she herself may not have fully understood, and those words reshaping the political map of the world. But we must not be naive. The oracle at Delphi was not only a religious institution, it was also a business. And like all businesses that operate at the intersection of power and information, it was deeply, unavoidably entangled in the world of money, influence, and corruption. The sanctuary at Delphi was, by the 5th century before the Common Era, one of the wealthiest places in the Greek world. The sacred way, the processional path that wound up the hillside from the entrance of the sanctuary to the temple of Apollo, was lined on both sides with treasure houses. These were small temple-like buildings, each constructed by a different Greek city, state, and each filled with offerings of staggering value, gold and silver vessels, bronze statues, ivory carvings, jeweled weapons, and dedications commemorating military victories. The treasury of the Scythians, built around 525 before the Common Era, was so lavishly decorated that Herodotus singles it out for special mention. The treasury of the Athenians, constructed after the Battle of Marathon, displayed captured Persian arms and armor. Each building was a statement of civic pride, a declaration of piety, and, perhaps most importantly, a bid for the oracle's favor. Because the oracle's favor could be bought. The ancient sources are remarkably frank about this. Herodotus, who is generally sympathetic to Delphi, nonetheless records multiple instances in which the oracle's pronouncements appear to have been influenced by bribes. The most famous case involves the Alcmaeonid family of Athens, the same family that would later produce Pericles. In the late 6th century, the Alcmaeonids were in exile from Athens, desperate to return to power. They contracted to rebuild the temple of Apollo, which had been destroyed by fire, and they went far beyond the terms of their contract, finishing the facade in expensive Parian marble when the agreement called for ordinary limestone. In return, Herodotus tells us bluntly, the Pythia began urging every Spartan who consulted the oracle, on any subject whatsoever, to liberate Athens from its tyrant. The Spartans, devout believers in the oracle, eventually complied. The tyrant Hippias was overthrown. The Alcmaeonids returned to power. And Delphi collected its fee. The consultation fee itself, called the palanos, was substantial. It varied depending on the status of the consultant, but even the standard fee was expensive enough to exclude the truly poor. And this was only the beginning. There were additional fees for the sacrificial animals, for the priest's services, for lodging and food in the sanctuary's guest houses. The wealthier consultants brought additional gifts, sometimes extravagantly generous ones, to ensure favorable treatment. The priests of Apollo at Delphi were not naive hermits. They were sophisticated men, literate, well-traveled, politically connected. They maintained an extensive network of contacts throughout the Greek world. Pilgrims and envoys arrived at Delphi from every corner of the Mediterranean, and they brought with them not only questions but information, news of political developments, military movements, economic conditions, social unrest. The priests collected this information, analyzed it, and used it to craft oracular responses that were informed by genuine intelligence. This is a crucial point. The oracle's prophecies were not random nonsense. They were carefully constructed statements, built on a foundation of real knowledge about the political situation, designed to be ambiguous enough to cover multiple outcomes, while still conveying genuine strategic advice. When the oracle told the Athenians to trust in wooden walls, the priests almost certainly knew about the Themistocles naval building program. When the oracle consistently favored Sparta over Athens in the years leading up to the Peloponnesian War, this likely reflected both Sparta's generous dedications to the sanctuary and the priests' assessment that Sparta's military power made it a better ally. The genius of the system was the ambiguity. Because the prophecies were always open to interpretation, the oracle could never be definitively proven wrong. If a prophecy seemed to fail, it was because the consultant had misinterpreted it, not because the god had erred. This made the oracle essentially unfalsifiable, which is the most powerful position any institution can occupy. You cannot lose an argument if your opponent can never prove you wrong. And the money flowed in. Year after year, century after century, the treasure accumulated. Gold lions and silver bowls, bronze cauldrons and ivory thrones, emeralds and rubies and sapphires set in electrum and pale gold. Delphi became not only a spiritual center, but a kind of central bank of the ancient world, a vast repository of wealth that represented the piety, the gratitude, and the fear of an entire civilization. Not everyone was impressed. In the year 399 before the Common Era, the philosopher Socrates was brought to trial in Athens on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. During his defense, as recorded by his student Plato in the Apology, Socrates described an event that had happened years earlier, an event that, he claimed, had defined the entire course of his philosophical life. Socrates' friend Xenophon had traveled to Delphi and asked the oracle a simple, direct question: "Is anyone wiser than Socrates?" And the Pythia's answer was equally direct, a rarity for Delphi. No, no one is wiser than Socrates. When Xenophon reported this to him, Socrates was, by his own account, deeply puzzled. He knew himself to be profoundly ignorant. He had no specialized knowledge, no technical expertise, no claim to wisdom in any conventional sense. How could the oracle, the voice of the god, declare him the wisest man in Athens?
And so Socrates set out to prove the oracle wrong. He went to the men who were reputed to be wise, the politicians, the poets, the craftsmen, and questioned them closely, probing the foundations of their knowledge. What he discovered was that none of them actually knew what they claimed to know. The politicians could not define justice. The poets could not explain the meaning of their own verses. The craftsmen, skilled in their particular trades, assumed that their expertise extended to matters far beyond their competence. They all believed themselves wise, but their wisdom was an illusion. And Socrates realized that this was the oracle's meaning. He was the wisest man in Athens, not because he knew more than others, but because he alone knew that he knew nothing.
His wisdom consisted entirely in the recognition of his own ignorance. The oracle had not flattered him. It had burdened him. It had given him a mission to go through Athens like a gadfly, stinging the city's complacency, forcing people to examine their assumptions, their beliefs, their lives. This is one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of Western thought. A cryptic utterance from a woman in a cave, a woman who may have been inhaling ethylene, who may have been manipulated by priests, who may have been speaking words she did not understand, became the founding impulse of the entire Socratic philosophical tradition. The idea that the examined life is the only life worth living, that true wisdom begins with the admission of ignorance, that the relentless questioning of assumptions is the highest human activity. All of this traces back in Socrates' own account to a single pronouncement from the oracle at Delphi. The irony is exquisite. The oracle, which dealt in ambiguity, in hidden meanings, in the manipulation of uncertainty, inspired the philosopher whose entire method was devoted to stripping away ambiguity and exposing the truth that lay beneath. Socrates took the oracle's darkness and turned it into light. But the light he created was too bright for Athens to bear. He was convicted. He was sentenced to death. He drank the hemlock, and so even the wisest man who ever lived could not escape the shadow of the oracle's words.
Let us slow down now. Let us leave the great events of history for a moment and simply walk. Walk with me along the sacred way, the ancient processional path that every pilgrim followed from the entrance of the sanctuary up to the temple of Apollo. Imagine it is early morning. The sun has just cleared the peaks of Parnassus, and the sanctuary is bathed in that extraordinary Greek light, clear, golden, almost liquid. The air is cool and smells of pine resin, wild oregano, and the faint, lingering sweetness of incense from the temple above. Your sandals crunch softly on the packed earth of the path. Beside you, other pilgrims walk in silence or whispered conversation. Merchants from Corinth, soldiers from Sparta, a delegation of robed priests from some distant colony.
The path begins at the southeastern gate and immediately begins to climb, switching back and forth up the terraced hillside in a series of gentle curves. On both sides, the treasury houses stand in close ranks, their painted facades, vivid reds and blues and golds, now faded to ghostly traces in the archaeological remains, but once blazing with color, competing for your attention like merchants in a bazaar. Here is the treasury of the Sisigonians, one of the oldest on the sacred way, its rounded tholos form marking it as an archaic construction. There is the treasury of the Thebans, built with the spoils of victory over a rival city. And there, just ahead, gleaming in the morning light, is the treasury of the Athenians, Small, elegant, built of white Parian marble, its metopes carved with scenes of Theseus and Heracles, the great Athenian heroes, wrestling monsters and bringing order to a savage world. Between the treasuries stand hundreds of statues and monuments, bronze warriors frozen in mid-stride, marble athletes poised to throw the discus, stone columns topped with sphinxes and griffins, and winged victories. Many of these are war memorials, dedicated by cities that had won battles and wished to advertise their prowess to the gods and to their rivals. The Sacred Way is, in this sense, a gallery of competitive piety, each city trying to outdo the others in the magnificence of its offerings, each using the sanctuary as a stage for political self-promotion. But there is something else in the air as well, something darker. As you climb higher, passing between the monuments, the shadows deepen. The cliffs of the Phaedriades loom overhead, blocking the sun. The path narrows. The sound of the Castalian spring, which had been a pleasant background murmur, grows louder, more insistent, and you begin to notice the inscriptions carved into the stone walls, painted on wooden tablets, scratched into the bases of statues, prayers, pleas, desperate messages to the god. Apollo, save my son. Lord, tell me if my husband lived. God of truth, who poisoned my brother. These are the voices of ordinary people. Not kings or generals, but farmers, mothers, sailors, slaves, people who had traveled days or weeks, spent money they could not afford, endured hardship and danger to come to this place and beg for answers. The Sacred Way was not just a monument to power and wealth. It was a corridor of human suffering, lined with the hopes and terrors of thousands upon thousands of mortal lives, stretching back century after century into the deep past.
And as you near the top, as the great temple of Apollo comes into view, its columns casting long shadows across the paving stones, its bronze doors closed and gleaming, you feel the weight of it all, the weight of so many prayers, the weight of so much need, the weight of a civilization that had placed its deepest uncertainties in the hands of a single institution, and that institution in the hands of a single woman, sitting on a tripod in the dark. You are close now. The altar is just ahead, stained dark with the blood of countless sacrifices. The smell of burnt offerings hangs in the air, animal fat, barley, laurel smoke. Priests move quietly between the columns, their white robes catching the light.
Somewhere below your feet, in the chamber beneath the temple, the Pythia is preparing. You take a breath, and you step forward. But Delphi offered more than prophecy. It offered glory. The Pythian Games, held every 4 years at Delphi in honor of Apollo, were one of the 4 great pan-Hellenic festivals of the ancient Greek world, alongside the Olympics at Olympia, the Isthmian Games at Corinth, and the Nemean Games at Ni. And while the Olympic Games are the ones that survive in modern memory, the Pythian Games had a character all their own, darker, stranger, more intimately connected to the divine mystery that permeated every stone of the sanctuary. The Games were said to have been founded by Apollo himself to celebrate his victory over the serpent Python. In their earliest form, they consisted entirely of musical competitions. Specifically, a contest in which musicians performed a piece called the Pythian Gnome, a complex composition for the kithara, the large Greek stringed instrument that narrated the story of Apollo's battle with the serpent. The piece moved through defined sections: the god's preparation, the battle itself, the death throes of the monster, the victory celebration, and the performer was judged on both technical skill and emotional expressiveness. Music was always at the heart of the Pythian Games, even after athletic competitions were added in the 6th century before the Common Era. This set the Pythian festival apart from the Olympics, which were entirely athletic. At Delphi, you could win glory not only with your body, but with your voice, your fingers on the strings, your breath in a wooden flute. Competitions were held in singing, in kithara playing, in aulos playing, the aulos being the double, reed instrument that produced the wild, keening music associated with ecstatic religious rites. There were contests for choral singing, for dramatic recitation, for painting. The athletic events were similar to those at Olympia: the stadion sprint, the long-distance dialos, wrestling, boxing, the brutal pancration, chariot racing, the pentathlon. The stadium at Delphi, carved into the mountainside above the temple, could seat approximately 5,000 spectators. The hippodrome, where the chariot races were held, was located on the plain far below the sanctuary, in the valley of the Pleistos River. But the prizes at Delphi were different from those at Olympia. At the Olympics, the victor received a crown of wild olive. At Delphi, the crown was made of laurel, Apollo's sacred plant, the leaves of the tree that had once been the nymph Daphne. To wear the laurel crown was to wear the god's favor on your head. It was a mark of divine selection, of a grace that went beyond mere athletic excellence into something transcendent. The atmosphere of the Pythian Games would have been extraordinary.
Imagine thousands of people from across the Greek world and later from across the Roman Empire gathered on the steep slopes of Mount Parnassus, the temple gleaming above them, the cliffs of the Phaedrides towering in the background, the sound of the aulos drifting through the mountain air, mixing with the cheers of the crowd and the distant murmur of the oracle below. Competition, devotion, and mystery woven together in a single intoxicating experience.
The victors at the Pythian Games became celebrities across the Greek world. The poet Pindar composed some of his most magnificent odes for Pythian victors, soaring, intricate poems that wove the athlete's achievement into the fabric of myth and divine favor. In his 9th Pythian ode, composed for a runner from Cyrene, Pindar reaches for the language of the divine itself. The athlete is compared to Apollo, the god who runs without tiring, the god whose arrows never miss. The poem transforms a foot race into a cosmic event, a momentary alignment of human effort and divine grace. But there was a darker side to the games as well. The competition was ferocious.
Athletes trained for years, sometimes decades, enduring brutal physical regimens that left many of them crippled or broken long before old age. The pancration, a savage combination of boxing and wrestling with almost no rules, regularly produced serious injuries and occasionally death. One famous pancratiast, a Hechin of Phigalia, won his 3rd consecutive Pythian crown while being strangled to death by his opponent. He managed to dislocate his opponent's ankle just as he expired, and the judges awarded him the victory posthumously. His corpse was crowned with laurel.
The chariot races were even more dangerous. The hippodrome at Delphi, set in the narrow valley below, was notorious for its tight turns and treacherous terrain. Crashes were common, spectacular, and often fatal for horses and drivers alike. The wealthy aristocrats who owned the chariot teams did not drive them personally. They hired professional charioteers, young men who risked their lives for glory and a share of the prize money, while the owners claimed the prestige of victory from the comfort of the spectators' stands.
There was something almost gladiatorial about it all, a reminder that the Greeks, for all their philosophy and art and democratic ideals, were a people who understood violence intimately, who wove it into their religious celebrations as naturally as they wove in music and prayer. The Pythian Games were not a respite from the darkness of Delphi. They were an expression of it, competition as ritual sacrifice, victory as a form of survival, the laurel crown placed on the winner's head like a mark of temporary reprieve from the death that waits for all of us. And when the games were over, and the crowds dispersed, and the last notes of the kithara faded into the mountain silence, the oracle remained, waiting, breathing,
speaking its dark truths to whoever was brave enough or desperate enough to ask. The cruelest thing about the oracle's prophecies was not that they were wrong, it was that they were right, but in ways that destroyed the very people who sought their guidance. Consider King Croesus of Lydia, the richest man in the world, whose name became a proverb for wealth. In the middle of the 6th century before the Common Era, Croesus was contemplating war with the Persian Empire, which was expanding rapidly under the brilliant and ruthless Cyrus the Great. Before committing to war, Croesus conducted an extraordinary test. He sent envoys to all the major oracles of the Greek world: Delphi, Dodona, the oracle of Amphiaraus at Oedipus, the oracle of Trophonius at Lebadia, and others, and instructed each envoy to ask the oracle, on the 100th day after their departure, what King Croesus was doing at that exact moment. Only Delphi got it right. The Pythia declared that Croesus was boiling a tortoise and a lamb together in a bronze cauldron, which is exactly what he was doing, a deliberately absurd act designed to be unguessable. Convinced of Delphi's authenticity, Croesus sent a second embassy with the question that really mattered: should he attack Persia? The oracle's response has become one of the most famous prophecies in history. If Croesus crosses the Halys River, a great empire will be destroyed. Croesus heard what he wanted to hear. He crossed the river. He attacked. And a great empire was indeed destroyed. His own. Cyrus defeated him utterly, captured his capital of Sardis, and took Croesus prisoner. According to one version of the story, Croesus was placed on a pyre to be burned alive, and as the flames rose around him, he cried out the name of the Athenian sage Solon, who had once warned him that no man should be called happy until he is dead. When Croesus later sent a bitter complaint to Delphi, his chains displayed before the Omphalos stone as evidence of his ruin, the oracle's response was ice cold. The prophecy had been fulfilled. A great empire had been destroyed. Croesus should have asked which empire. The fault was his, not the gods. This pattern, the prophecy that is technically true but practically devastating, runs through the entire history of the oracle like a dark thread. The myth of Oedipus is perhaps the most famous example, though it predates the historical oracle and belongs to the realm of legend. Oedipus's father, King Laius of Thebes, consults Delphi and is told that his son will kill him and marry his own mother. To prevent this, Laius orders the infant Oedipus to be killed. But the child survives, grows up in ignorance of his true parentage, and eventually, trying to flee a prophecy he has heard from Delphi himself, kills a stranger on a road who turns out to be his father, and marries the widowed queen who turns out to be his mother. The prophecy was not merely fulfilled, it was fulfilled because the people who received it tried to prevent it. The act of trying to escape the prophecy was the mechanism by which the prophecy came true. This is the darkest insight of the Greek prophetic tradition, that knowledge of the future does not free you from it, it binds you to it more tightly. The oracle's words are not warnings, they are chains. There is a particular horror in this idea, a horror that goes beyond the merely tragic, because it suggests that the universe is not indifferent to human suffering. It is actively, deliberately cruel. The gods do not merely know will happen, they tell you what will happen, and then they watch as your attempts to escape prove that escape was never possible. The oracle is not a source of hope, it is the instrument of a cosmic sadism, a machine for demonstrating that free will is an illusion, and that the only certainty in human life is that you will be destroyed by the very thing you most feared. And yet people kept coming. Century after century, they climbed the sacred way, paid their fees, offered their sacrifices, and asked their questions. Because even in a universe of predetermined suffering, the human need to know, to understand, to prepare, to hope, is stronger than the fear of what the knowing might bring. That is perhaps the darkest prophecy of all. Delphi was the most famous oracle in the ancient world, but it was not the only one. The Greeks, and later the Romans, maintained a network of oracular sites across the Mediterranean, each with its own methods, its own traditions, and its own eerie atmosphere. And understanding these other oracles helps us understand what made Delphi unique and what made the phenomenon of Greek prophecy so much more than a single woman on a tripod. The oldest oracle in Greece, older even than Delphi, was at Dodona, in the remote northwestern region of Epirus. Here the god Zeus, not Apollo, spoke through the rustling leaves of a great sacred oak tree. The priests of Dodona, called the Seloi, slept on the bare ground and never washed their feet. Homeric details that suggest a very ancient, very primitive cult, rooted in a time before temples and tripods, when the divine was sought not in elaborate rituals, but in the raw, unmediated voice of nature. Consultants at Dodona wrote their questions on thin lead tablets, many of which have survived. They are extraordinary documents, small, curled strips of lead, scratched with questions that are sometimes heartbreaking in their simplicity. Shall I marry? Will my wife bear me a son? Did Thopas steal my blanket? These are not the questions of kings and generals. They are the questions of ordinary people, reaching out into the darkness for any scrap of reassurance or guidance. The oracle at Dodona interpreted the will of Zeus through several methods. The rustling of the oak leaves in the wind, the flight of doves in the sacred grove, and the sound made by bronze cauldrons arranged in a circle around the tree, which would ring and vibrate when the wind blew or when the priests struck them. The sound, a deep, resonant hum that would have filled the grove with an almost hypnotic vibration, must have been deeply unsettling. Imagine standing in the half-darkness beneath the ancient oak, its branches groaning in the wind, while all around you the bronze vessels sang their strange metallic song. You would not need ethylene to feel the presence of the divine. Far to the east, on the coast of Asia Minor near the city of Miletus, stood the oracle of Apollo at Didyma.
This was one of the largest and most spectacular temple complexes in the ancient world. Its unfinished temple would have been the largest Greek temple ever built if it had been completed. At Didyma, the prophetess, who, like the Pythia, was a woman, delivered her oracles after bathing her feet and the hem of her garment in a sacred spring and inhaling the smoke of burning laurel. The parallels with Delphi are obvious and suggest a common tradition, perhaps a common origin.
But the most dramatic of all the alternative oracles was the one that Alexander the Great sought out at the most critical moment of his astonishing career. In 330, one before the Common Era, after conquering Egypt and founding the city of Alexandria, Alexander made a dangerous and physically grueling journey across the Libyan desert to reach the oracle of Zeus, Ammon at the Siwa oasis. Why? Alexander had already conquered most of the known world. He did not need military advice. What he needed was something far more profound and far more dangerous, divine confirmation of his own nature. Alexander believed, or wanted to believe, that he was not merely a mortal king, but the son of a god. And the oracle at Siwa, unlike the Greek oracles, had a tradition of confirming the divine parentage of pharaohs and kings. The journey nearly killed him. The desert crossing took 8 days through waterless wasteland, with blinding sandstorms that obliterated the path. According to ancient accounts, the expedition was saved by a miraculous rainstorm and guided to the oasis by a pair of crows, or, in some versions, a pair of serpents. When Alexander finally reached the temple, the high priest greeted him, according to Plutarch, as son of Zeus. Whether this was a standard greeting for visiting royalty or a specific calculated political gesture has been debated for over 2,000 years. Alexander never revealed what the oracle told him during his private consultation. He said only that he had heard what his heart desired. He carried the secret to his grave. But from that day forward, he openly encouraged the worship of himself as a divine being. And the coins he minted showed him wearing the ram's horns of Zeus, Ammon curling from his temples, if the oracle at Siwa had given Alexander something that Delphi with all its ambiguity, could never quite provide. Certainty. The certainty that he was more than human. Whether that certainty was a gift or a curse, whether it sustained him through his extraordinary conquests or drove him to the madness and megalomania that consumed his final years, is a question that history has never fully answered. Perhaps even oracles cannot answer it. What we can say is that the existence of these alternative oracles, Dodona with its whispering oak, Didyma with its sacred spring, Siwa with its desert isolation, reveals something fundamental about the ancient Greek relationship with the unknown. The Greeks did not merely tolerate uncertainty, they built institutions around it. They created sacred spaces where uncertainty itself became a kind of doorway, a threshold between the known and the unknowable. Each oracle was a different door. Each one opened onto a different aspect of the darkness, but they all led to the same place, the terrifying, exhilarating frontier where human knowledge ends and something else begins. Delphi was simply the grandest of these doors, the most elaborately decorated, the most politically powerful, the most dangerous to approach, and the most devastating to pass through. But it was not alone. Across the ancient world, in groves and caves and desert oases, the gods were speaking. And mortals were listening, trembling, hoping that the words they heard would save them rather than destroy them. Most of the time, they hoped in vain. All things end. Even the voice of the gods beat. The decline of the oracle at Delphi was slow, uneven, and deeply entangled with the larger collapse of the world that had created it. As the independent Greek states lost their freedom, first to Macedon, then to Rome, the oracle lost the political context that had given it meaning. There were no more independent states sending envoys to ask whether they should go to war. There was only Rome, Aid. The Romans treated Delphi with a mixture of reverence and exploitation. They respected the oracle's antiquity and its cultural prestige, but they also looted it repeatedly. The general Sulla stripped the sanctuary of much of its treasure to finance his civil war in the 1st century before the Common Era. The Emperor Nero, visiting Delphi in the 1st century of the Common Era, reportedly carried off 500 bronze statues. The great wealth that had accumulated over centuries was steadily drained away, and with it, much of the sanctuary's political relevance. But the oracle continued to function, after a fashion. Plutarch, who served as one of the 2 permanent priests at Delphi in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries of the Common Era, wrote several fascinating essays about the oracle that reveal an institution in deep decline. He notes that the oracle now required only a single Pythia, where once there had been 2 or even 3 working in rotation to handle the volume of consultants. He discusses the declining quality of the prophecies. They were now delivered in plain prose rather than hexameter verse, and they were less impressive, less resonant, less inspired than the great prophecies of the classical age. Plutarch struggles to explain this decline. He considers various theories: that the pneuma has weakened, that the gods have withdrawn their attention, that the world itself has grown old and tired. There is something deeply poignant about this brilliant, devout man, trying to understand why the institution he serves and loves is slowly dying. He cannot bring himself to admit the obvious, that the oracle is declining because the world has changed, and the oracle has not changed with it. The rise of Christianity dealt the final blow. The early Christians viewed the pagan oracles with a mixture of horror and contempt. They were, in Christian theology, not the voices of gods, but the voices of demons, evil spirits who had deceived humanity for centuries, leading people away from the one true God. As Christianity became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century of the Common Era, the old sanctuaries were systematically shut down, their treasures confiscated, their priests dispersed. The last recorded prophecy of the oracle at Delphi was delivered in 393 of the Common Era, when the Roman Emperor Julian, called the apostate because he attempted to reverse the Christianization of the empire and restore the old pagan religions, sent his physician Oedipus to consult the oracle. The response that came back was one of the most haunting utterances in all of ancient literature. To tell the king, the fair wrought hall has fallen to the ground. No longer has Phoebus a hut, nor a prophetic laurel, nor a spring that speaks. The water of speech is quenched. The god was gone. The spring was silent. The laurel had withered. After more than 1,000 years, the voice of Apollo at Delphi spoke its final words. And those words were an announcement of its own death. Julian himself was killed in battle against the Persians the following year. The restoration of paganism died with him, and Delphi fell silent forever. The temple was eventually dismantled, its stones carried off for use in other buildings. Earthquakes shattered what remained. The mountain reclaimed the sacred precinct, burying it under centuries of soil and rockfall. The sacred way disappeared beneath a village called Castri, whose inhabitants built their houses over the ruins without knowing or caring what lay beneath. It was not until the late 19th century that French archaeologists, working under an agreement with the Greek government, excavated the site and revealed the ruins that visitors see today. The broken columns, the empty treasury houses, the stadium carved into the mountainside, the omphalos stone sitting quiet and alone in a museum case, far from the chamber where it once marked the center of the world. And yet tips stand at Delphi today, among the ruins, and you will feel something. Not the voice of a god, perhaps. Not the pneuma rising from the earth, but something. A quality in the air, a weight in the silence, a sense that this place remembers what it was, and that the memory has not entirely faded. Two phrases were carved above the entrance to the temple of Apollo. Two phrases that outlived the temple, outlived the oracle, outlived the civilization that created them. Two phrases that speak to us across 25 centuries with undiminished clarity and power. The first, Genothi Seoten. Know thyself. The second, Meden Agan. Nothing in excess. These are not merely philosophical maxims. They are warnings. They are the distilled wisdom of an institution that spent 1,000 years watching human beings make the same mistakes over and over again, the same arrogance, the same greed, the same refusal to accept the limits of their own understanding. Croesus did not know himself. He believed himself invincible, and he was destroyed. The Athenians, drunk on their victory over Persia, pursued excess in empire, in ambition, in pride, and their excess brought them to ruin in the Peloponnesian War. Know thyself. Know your limits. Know your weaknesses. Know that you are mortal, that your knowledge is incomplete, that the universe is larger and stranger and more dangerous than you can possibly imagine. And nothing in excess. Not wealth, not power, not ambition, not even wisdom. Because excess of any kind warps the soul and blinds the mind. And a blind mind in a dangerous world is a mind walking toward a cliff edge in the dark. The oracle at Delphi is gone. The Pythia no longer sits upon her tripod. The pneuma no longer rises from the earth. The laurel smoke no longer curls through the shadowed chamber of the Adyton. The priests no longer stand in the pronaos, waiting to translate the raw, unfiltered voice of the divine into words that mortals can understand or misunderstand. But the mystery remains. The question that Delphi posed for 1,000 years, whether there is a voice in the darkness, whether the universe speaks to those who listen, whether the future can be known, and, if it can, whether knowing it is a blessing or a curse. That question has not been answered. It has only been rephrased. We no longer consult oracles, but we consult algorithms, data models, probability matrices, artificial intelligences. We still seek to know what is coming. We still fear uncertainty. We still want someone, something, to tell us that everything will be all right. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind moves through the pines on the mountainside, and the stars wheel overhead in their ancient courses, and the ruins of the temple stand pale and silent in the moonlight, sometimes, if you listen very carefully, you can almost hear it. A whisper, a murmur, the faintest echo of a voice that once made kings tremble and empires fall. The water of speech is quenched, but the silence it left behind still speaks too. Thank you for joining me tonight on Ancient Greek Archive. Before you drift off, I want to ask you something. Of all the mysteries of the ancient world, which one would you like us to explore next? The lost library of Alexandria, where the sum of human knowledge was said to have burned in a single night. The dark underworld of ancient Greek medicine, where the line between healing and poison was thinner than a blade. Or perhaps the myth of Atlantis, the lost civilization that Plato described with such precision that people have been searching for it ever since. Leave your answer in the comments below, and we will follow wherever your curiosity leads. Until next time, sleep well, and may the gods of the ancient world walk gently through your dreams.